Okay, as I said, this last part, we'll finish up our discussion on fungi. It probably won't be quite as long as the last two parts. But what we're looking at here is Myxomycota. Myxomycota is a fungus that looks like a protozoa for much of its life. And that's why it's called Myxomycota. It's somewhat confusing in its appearance. Because that it looks like protozoa, there's been a strong discussion about whether it should be part of the kingdom Protista as opposed to the kingdom fungi. It actually has to do with the fact that its reproductive cycle is very much like a fungus, whereas it's the way it eats and the way it lives is very much like a protozoa. And depending on which camp you're in, if you think that a way a organism lives and eats is the most important thing, then that's the kingdom it's in. Whereas if you think the way that it reproduces is the most important thing, then that's the kingdom it's in. You've probably read in your book that they favor the reproductive side because there are a lot of very similar animals, such as wildcat versus a tiger versus a lion, all of whom eat very differently, while being all carnivores, of course. They all eat very differently, eat very different kinds of animals, they hunt differently, blah, blah, blah. And yet no one would doubt that they should be in the same kingdom Animalia. And they all reproduce in very much the same way. So that has been part of the discussion around this phylum of organisms. They're also called slime molds. As I said, they behave like a fungus when they reproduce, but they behave like a protista when they feed. And this mass that you're looking at right here is a mass of the slime mold. It's also called a plasmodium, and you'll recognize that term because plasmodium was a type of protista that we studied last week. And this is the feeding stage of the slime mold. And this is how it looks when it is feeding. Now, we're going to finish up our discussion talking about symbiosis. And symbiosis, as you know, is a close relationship between two or more species where at least one of those two species benefits. Now, there are several types of symbiosis. There's commensalism and there's mutualism. Commensalism, one of the two organisms benefits and the other is unaffected. Mutualism is when both organisms are benefited. And what I'm going to talk about this time is a situation where both organisms are benefited. And that's called a lichen. A lichen is a mutualistic relationship that occurs between a fungus and an algae. Usually, the algae is from the chloroalgal group, which is the algal group that produces energy or produces its energy by photosynthesis. And what you have is a situation where the algae produce the energy and the fungus provide, let's say, a house to live in, protection. So here's an example of that situation. And what you have is on the outside, you have the fungal hyphae out here on both sides, and they are protecting what's inside. And then also the hyphae are interdigitated with all these algal forms. Now the algae produce energy by photosynthesis, and this energy, part of the nutrient energy that's produced through this photosynthetic process, is then absorbed by the algae and taken into by the fungus and taken into the fungus. And so the fungus provides for protection and the algae provides the food. Now, as it says in the book, the algae can live without the fungus, but the fungus can't really live without the algae. And so in some respects, it's a little bit more commensal. That is, the fungus gets most of the benefit and the algae just gets a little bit of benefit, as opposed to being truly mutualistic where both are dependent on the other. Now, how do these reproduce? Well, if they depend on each other, then how would they reproduce? That's the interesting question. And what happens is that spores from the algae and spores from the fungus unite and form a dust-like substance that contains both algae and DNA spores. And because of that, they both grow up together. And this is how a lichen reproduces. And so this dust-like substance, called a sordium, is a spore that actually has united inside of it a spore from an algae and a spore from fungi at the same time. And then they germinate, as it were, and grow up together. Now, the other mutualistic relationship that I wanted to mention is something called mycorrhiza. And mycorrhiza is a different kind of symbiosis, but it occurs very commonly, and it's extremely important in plant survival. And I'm going to show you a picture of it here. And what happens is you have this right here is the root of the plant. And then outside the root of the plant, you have fungi growing on the outside of the root of the plant. And then what occurs is literally a parasitic-like haustral penetration of the root cells by the fungal hyphae. These root cells then produce energy and nutrients, which the hyphae take in, and the hyphae produce minerals and other substances that the plant needs. And so, again, although it almost appears as if there's a parasitic relationship here, it's not truly parasitic, because the plant does much better if it has this fungi on the outside. Now, another specialized mutualistic relationship is something called, that occurs particularly with plants that are tubers, and I'll explain that at some point in the future. But there are little nodules that grow outside there that contain organisms that produce nitrogen. And that nitrogen is important for the plant to absorb nitrogen from the soil. The soil itself does not have sufficient nitrogen. But a mycorrhiza is this mutualistic relationship where the fungi produce minerals and other substances that the plant needs, and the plant produces food for the fungus. And that concludes this section of the biology lectures. We will have a discussion of this on October 17th and a quiz on this. Then the final examination in biology will be due on October 24th, and then you'll have your spring break, or excuse me, fall break.